Have you ever noticed how the moment you start feeling proud of yourself, a voice inside whispers that you're being arrogant? How the second you acknowledge your own worth, something deep within you recoils in shame? You've been taught that confidence is dangerous, that self-love is selfish, that believing in yourself makes you a narcissist. But what if I told you this isn't wisdom? What if this voice that keeps you small, that makes you apologize for existing, that forces you to shrink every time you dare to shine? What if this voice was planted there? You think humility is a virtue. You believe that putting yourself down is noble, that minimizing your achievements makes you a better person. But there's a difference between true humility and the psychological warfare disguised as virtue that's been programmed into your mind since childhood. You've been conditioned to hate yourself and call it holiness, to sabotage yourself and call it modesty, to disappear and call it grace. This isn't about becoming arrogant or losing your capacity for genuine humility. This is about recognizing the difference between healthy self-awareness and the toxic self-hatred that masquerades as spiritual growth. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that your worth was conditional, that you had to earn love by being less, that you had to apologize for the space you occupy in this world. But what happens when you realize that the very thing you call humility is actually the chains that keep you imprisoned? What happens when you discover that true strength doesn't come from making yourself smaller, but from finally, courageously, taking up the space you were always meant to fill? What happens when you understand that they didn't just teach you to be humble, they taught you to hate yourself so efficiently that you became your own prison guard? The story I'm about to tell you isn't comfortable. It's about how an entire culture conspired to convince you that your natural state of being is wrong, how they took your innate sense of worth and twisted it into something shameful, how they hijacked your spiritual longing and turned it into a weapon against your own soul. But it's also about the way back, the way home to yourself. Alfred Adler understood something that most people never realize. He saw that behind every inferiority complex lies a superiority complex trying to hide. But what he didn't fully explore was how society deliberately cultivates this split, how culture weaponizes your natural desire for belonging against your own self-worth. You weren't born hating yourself. This was taught to you carefully, systematically, until it became so natural you can't imagine living any other way. Think about your earliest memories of praise. Were you allowed to bask in it? Were you permitted to feel genuinely good about yourself? Or were you immediately reminded not to get too big for your britches, not to become full of yourself? The moment you showed signs of healthy self-esteem, the correction came swift and certain. You learned that feeling good about yourself was dangerous territory, that confidence was a character flaw, that believing in your own worth made you unlikable. This is where false humility is born. It's not humility at all, it's self-hatred dressed up in spiritual clothing. True humility is knowing your place in the universe without diminishing your inherent worth. False humility is convincing yourself that you have no worth to begin with. One is wisdom, the other is psychological suicide. And you've been practicing the latter so long you've forgotten the difference. The most insidious part of this programming is how it disguises itself as virtue. You're told that putting yourself down shows character, that deflecting compliments demonstrates grace, that hiding your light proves your goodness. But what's really happening is you're being trained to be invisible, to take up less space, to need less, to expect less, to be grateful for scraps while convincing yourself that wanting more makes you greedy. Watch how this plays out in your daily interactions. When someone compliments you, you immediately deflect. When you achieve something, you minimize it. When you succeed, you attribute it to luck or others. You've been so thoroughly conditioned to reject positive feedback about yourself that you literally cannot absorb it. Your nervous system has been programmed to experience self-appreciation as danger. Your body tenses when you feel proud. Your mind races to find flaws when others see strengths. You've been trained to be allergic to your own worth. But here's the cruelest part. They convinced you this allergic reaction was spiritual maturity. They told you that your discomfort with praise proved your humility. They said your inability to accept compliments showed your groundedness. They praised you for your self-deprecation, rewarded you for your self-diminishment, and called your self-rejection wisdom. You became addicted to the approval you got for disapproving of yourself. Erich Fromm spent his life studying how societies create compliant individuals, and he discovered that the most effective control isn't physical, it's psychological. You don't need chains when you can convince someone they don't deserve freedom. You don't need walls when you can teach someone to build their own prison and call it home. This is exactly what happened to your relationship with yourself. They didn't just discourage your confidence, they made you complicit in your own diminishment. The process started early. Every time you achieved something, the focus was immediately shifted to what you still lacked. Every time you felt proud, you were reminded of others who had more. Every time you dared to feel special, you were told that everyone is special, which is another way of saying no one is. The message was clear. Your worth is always relative, always conditional, always insufficient. You learn to measure yourself against an impossible standard and call the inevitable failure humility. But the cruelest part wasn't the external messaging. It was how you internalized it. You became your own worst critic, your own harshest judge, your own most effective prison guard. They didn't need to keep telling you that you weren't enough because you took over the job. You became so efficient at diminishing yourself that you started doing it preemptively. Before anyone else could criticize you, you criticized yourself. Before anyone could reject you, you rejected yourself. Before anyone could abandon you, you abandoned yourself. This is where the real damage lives, in the space between who you are and who you think you're allowed to be, in the gap between your natural radiance and the dimmed version you present to the world. You've spent so much energy making yourself smaller that you've forgotten what your actual size is. You've been shrinking for so long that expansion feels like sin. You've been apologizing for existing for so many years that taking up space feels like theft. The programming was so complete that you stopped questioning it. You stopped noticing how you edit yourself in real time, how you tone down your enthusiasm because it might be too much, how you hide your intelligence because it might intimidate others, how you minimize your achievements because celebrating them feels wrong, how you apologize for having needs, for taking time, for existing in ways that affect others. You learn to be a ghost in your own life, present but not really there, existing but not really living. And they called this maturity. They said your self-erasure was growth. They praised your ability to disappear and called it evolution. They told you that the smaller you became, the more spiritual you were, that the less you needed, the more enlightened you were, that the more you suffered in silence, the more noble you were. They convinced you that your pain was proof of your virtue and your joy was evidence of your selfishness. Carl Gustav Jung warned about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny and repress. But what he also understood was how organized religion and social conditioning could hijack genuine spiritual development, turning it into a tool for psychological control. True spirituality expands your sense of self and connection to something greater. False spirituality, the kind that's been sold to you as virtue, contracts your sense of self until you disappear entirely. You've been spiritually hijacked, and the ransom demand is your own worth. Look at how spiritual concepts have been twisted into weapons against your self-esteem. Humility became self-hatred. Surrender became self-abandonment. Service became self-sacrifice. Devotion became self-destruction. Every genuine spiritual principle was perverted into a reason why you should think less of yourself, want less for yourself, expect less from life. You were taught that the path to enlightenment runs through the complete annihilation of your ego, your desires, your very self. But here's what they didn't tell you. You can't transcend what you've never owned. You can't surrender what you've never possessed. You can't sacrifice what you've never valued. The spiritual path requires a strong, integrated self to begin with, not the fragmented, self-hating shell they convinced you was holy. True spiritual growth comes from wholeness, not from the pieces left after you've systematically destroyed everything that makes you human. This spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid psychological work, has kept you trapped in a cycle of self-negation that masquerades as growth. You think you're evolving when you're actually dissolving. You think you're transcending when you're actually hiding. You think you're becoming more spiritual when you're actually becoming less human. And all the while, those who benefit from your diminishment cheer you on, calling your self-destruction enlightenment. The most insidious part of this spiritual hijacking is how it weaponizes your deepest longings against you. Your desire for connection becomes a reason to lose yourself in others. Your yearning for meaning becomes a justification for meaningless suffering. Your search for truth becomes an excuse to deny your own reality. Your quest for love becomes a mandate to hate yourself. They took everything beautiful about your spiritual nature and turned it into a tool of oppression. They convinced you that your desires were obstacles to overcome rather than information to honor, that your emotions were weaknesses to transcend rather than wisdom to embrace, that your body was a prison to escape rather than a temple to inhabit, that your personality was a mask to dissolve rather than an expression to celebrate. They made you believe that becoming spiritual meant becoming less human, when the opposite is true. The result is a kind of spiritual schizophrenia where you're simultaneously seeking connection while destroying the self that could connect, where you're pursuing wholeness while systematically fragmenting yourself, where you're chasing enlightenment while dimming your own light, where you're trying to find God while erasing the divine within yourself. You've been taught to seek outside yourself what you've been trained to destroy inside yourself. Rollo May understood that anxiety isn't just a personal problem. It's often a rational response to an irrational world. And what could be more irrational than a system that requires you to hate yourself in order to function within it? Your self-hatred isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Because people who don't believe they deserve better don't demand better. People who think they're inherently flawed don't question the systems that keep them down. People who believe their suffering is deserved don't fight for their liberation. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. You accept less money because you don't believe you're worth more. You tolerate disrespectful treatment because you think you deserve it. You give away your time and energy for free because you've been convinced that self-care is selfish. You apologize for your needs, minimize your pain, and gaslight yourself into believing that your dissatisfaction is a character flaw. This isn't humility. It's economic oppression disguised as virtue. The most profitable citizen is one who works harder for less, demands nothing, and blames themselves for their circumstances. The most manageable employee is one who believes their worth is tied to their productivity, and their productivity is never enough. The most controllable person is one who has been convinced that their discontent is a spiritual failing rather than a rational response to exploitation. Your self-hatred is someone else's profit margin. But here's where it gets even more twisted. They've convinced you that wanting more is greed, that expecting better is entitlement, that believing in your worth is arrogance. So you police yourself, you keep yourself small, you limit your own possibilities before anyone else has to. You've become so efficient at self-oppression that external oppression barely needs to exist. You've internalized the voice of every system that benefits from your diminishment and made it your own inner wisdom. Look at how this plays out in your relationships. You give more than you receive and call it love. You sacrifice your needs for others' wants and call it caring. You accept crumbs and call it gratitude. You endure abuse and call it patience. You disappear into other people's lives and call it service. You've been trained to equate your value with your utility, your worth with your willingness to disappear. The less you exist as a separate person, the more virtuous you're told you are. This economic system of self-hatred extends beyond money into every area of your life. You pay with your health by ignoring your body's needs. You pay with your sanity by accepting gaslighting as normal. You pay with your dreams by convincing yourself they're selfish. You pay with your time by believing everyone else's urgency is more important than your own peace. You pay with your energy by carrying other people's emotional burdens while neglecting your own. You've become a human ATM, dispensing yourself freely while never making deposits. The most brilliant part of this system is how it made you volunteer for your own exploitation. You weren't forced into self-hatred. You were convinced it was virtuous. You weren't dragged into self-sacrifice. You were told it was love. You weren't pushed into self-denial. You were persuaded it was spiritual. You became the enforcer of your own oppression, the guard of your own prison, the critic of your own worth. Friedrich Nietzsche declared the death of God not because he hated the divine, but because he saw how the concept had been weaponized against human potential. He understood that when you convince someone they are inherently sinful, flawed, and unworthy, you rob them of their power to create meaning, to assert their will, to become who they're meant to be. What Nietzsche called the slave morality is exactly what you've been taught to call humility. A system of values designed to keep you subservient to forces that benefit from your powerlessness. True rebellion isn't about becoming arrogant or narcissistic. It's about recognizing the difference between healthy self-regard and toxic self-obsession. It's about understanding that you can acknowledge your flaws without making them your identity. You can recognize your limitations without making them your reality. You can admit your mistakes without making them your worth. The path forward isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. This rebellion starts with a simple but radical act, believing you deserve to exist without justification. Not because of what you accomplish, not because of how you serve others, not because of how small you make yourself, but simply because you are. Your worth isn't earned, it's inherent. Your value isn't conditional, it's absolute. Your right to space, to breath, to dreams, to desires, isn't dependent on your ability to prove yourself worthy. It's yours by virtue of being alive. But here's what they never told you about this kind of self-acceptance. It's terrifying. Because once you stop hating yourself, you have to start taking responsibility for your life. Once you stop seeing yourself as inherently flawed, you have to start seeing the systems that told you that lie. Once you stop accepting less than you deserve, you have to start demanding more. Once you stop apologizing for existing, you have to start actually living. The rebellion against false humility requires you to question everything you've been taught about virtue. It demands that you examine whether your selflessness is actually self-loss, whether your modesty is actually self-denial, whether your humility is actually self-hatred, whether your spirituality is actually self-destruction. It asks you to consider the possibility that much of what you've been calling growth has actually been shrinkage. This questioning isn't comfortable. It means looking at years or decades of conditioning and recognizing how thoroughly you've been programmed. It means seeing how your desire to be good was used against you, how your longing to belong was weaponized against your selfhood, how your spiritual seeking was hijacked to serve systems that benefit from your powerlessness. It means grieving the person you might have been if you hadn't been taught to hate yourself. But rebellion also means reclaiming what was stolen from you. Your right to feel proud of your achievements, your permission to take up space, your freedom to have needs and express them, your ability to receive love without feeling guilty, your capacity to shine without dimming yourself for others' comfort, your power to say no without justifying it, your sovereignty over your own life. If this is resonating with something deep inside you, if you're starting to see the elaborate programming that convinced you to hate yourself and call it virtue, don't keep this realization to yourself. Subscribe to this channel and share this message, because the people who need to hear this most are the ones who've been trained to believe they don't deserve to take up space, to have a voice, to matter. The revolution starts with recognizing that your self-hatred was never holy. It was a tool of control. Viktor Frankl discovered in the concentration camps that the last human freedom is the ability to choose your attitude in any given circumstances. But what if your circumstances include the systematic programming of self-hatred disguised as virtue? What if your attitude has been shaped by forces that benefit from your diminishment? The ultimate act of freedom isn't just choosing your response to external circumstances. It's recognizing and rejecting the internal programming that was never yours to begin with. Reclaiming your sovereign self begins with the radical recognition that you have been colonized. Your thoughts about yourself, your beliefs about your worth, your assumptions about what you deserve. Most of these weren't chosen by you. They were installed by a culture that needed you compliant, by institutions that required your submission, by systems that profited from your self-doubt. The voice in your head that tells you that you're not enough, that you're asking for too much, that you should be grateful for scraps. That's not your voice. It's an invader. The process of decolonizing your mind isn't gentle. It's not a gradual awakening accompanied by soft music and positive affirmations. It's more like surgery without anesthesia. You have to cut out beliefs that have been growing in you like tumors, poisoning your relationship with yourself for years or decades. You have to grieve the person you might have been if you hadn't been taught to hate yourself. You have to rage against the systems that stole your birthright of self-love and called it virtue. But here's what happens when you start this process. You discover that beneath all the programming, beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the lies you've been told about yourself, there's something unbreakable. There's a core of pure being that was never touched by their poison. There's a self that existed before they told you who you should be, and that self is still there, waiting. It's been waiting your entire life for you to stop apologizing for its existence and start celebrating it. Reclaiming sovereignty means learning to distinguish between your authentic voice and the colonizing voices that have occupied your mind. It means developing the ability to hear the difference between genuine intuition and internalized oppression. It means recognizing when you're making choices from your own center versus when you're reacting from programming. It means becoming the author of your own story instead of a character in someone else's narrative. This process requires developing what could be called spiritual immunity, the ability to recognize and reject toxic messaging about your worth, regardless of how it's packaged. Whether it comes disguised as religion, spirituality, self-help, or social norms, you learn to identify the signature of systems that require your diminishment to function. You develop antibodies against messages that ask you to be less so that others can be more. The sovereign self isn't selfish. It's essential. It's not narcissistic. It's necessary. It's not arrogant. It's authentic. Because only from a place of genuine self-worth can you offer genuine service to the world. Only from a foundation of self-love can you love others without losing yourself. Only from a position of personal sovereignty can you contribute to collective liberation. Your wholeness isn't a threat to others' well-being, it's a prerequisite for it. But sovereignty comes with responsibility. Once you recognize that you've been programmed, you can't claim ignorance anymore. Once you see how the system works, you can't pretend to be helpless within it. Once you understand your own worth, you can't accept treatment that contradicts it. Once you reclaim your power, you have to decide how to use it. And that decision determines whether your liberation serves only yourself or becomes a catalyst for others' freedom as well. We've traveled deep into the psychological underground tonight, and what we've found isn't pretty. We've discovered that what you've been calling humility is actually a sophisticated form of self-abuse. That what you've been calling virtue is actually a survival mechanism that's outlived its usefulness. That what you've been calling spiritual growth is actually spiritual suicide. But we've also discovered something else, the path back to yourself. True humility isn't about making yourself smaller. It's about right-sizing yourself in relationship to the universe. It's about recognizing that you are neither the center of existence nor irrelevant to it. You are a unique expression of life itself, and that uniqueness isn't something to hide or apologize for. It's something to celebrate and express fully. Your gifts aren't meant to be buried under false modesty. Your light isn't meant to be dimmed to make others comfortable. Your worth isn't meant to be conditional on your ability to disappear. The work ahead isn't easy. Deprogramming decades of conditioning takes time, patience, and tremendous courage. You'll have moments where the old voice returns, where the familiar self-hatred feels safer than the unfamiliar territory of self-love. You'll have people in your life who are invested in your diminishment react with alarm to your expansion. You'll face systems that punish your self-worth and reward your compliance. But you'll also discover something they never wanted you to know. You are stronger than their programming. The most radical act you can commit in a world that trained you to hate yourself is to love yourself fiercely, unapologetically, completely. Not the conditional love that depends on your performance, but the unconditional love that recognizes your inherent worth. Not the narcissistic love that needs to diminish others, but the sovereign love that lifts everyone around you by refusing to play small. Not the naive love that ignores your flaws, but the mature love that embraces your wholeness. But this isn't just about personal liberation, it's about collective transformation. Every person who breaks free from the programming of self-hatred weakens the system that depends on that programming to function. Every individual who reclaims their sovereignty makes it easier for others to do the same. Every voice that refuses to be silenced gives permission for other voices to rise. Your healing isn't selfish, it's revolutionary. The path of self-reclamation is ultimately the path of coming home. Home to your own body, your own truth, your own worth. Home to the self that was never broken, only buried. Home to the knowing that you don't need to earn your place in this world. You belong here simply because you exist. Home to the understanding that your worth isn't negotiable, your value isn't debatable, and your right to be fully yourself isn't conditional. This homecoming requires courage. The courage to disappoint people who were invested in your smallness. The courage to take up space in a world that told you to shrink. The courage to shine in a culture that rewards dimness. The courage to love yourself in a society that profits from your self-hatred. The courage to be whole in a system that functions by keeping you fragmented. If this message has awakened something in you, if you're ready to begin the sacred work of reclaiming yourself from the forces that colonized your mind, then subscribe to this channel and share this video with others who might need to hear it. Because the world doesn't need more people who hate themselves and call it virtue. The world needs people who love themselves enough to show up fully, to take up space, to shine without apology. The world needs you to remember who you were before they convinced you to forget. Your humility was never meant to be your funeral. It was meant to be your foundation. Now build something magnificent on it. The revolution begins with you remembering that you were never the problem. Your light was never too bright. Your dreams were never too big. Your worth was never conditional. They trained you to believe otherwise, but now you know the truth. And the truth will not just set you free, it will set everyone around you free as well.